Will Vietnam become a developed country? But while Vietnam will likely continue to thrive as it attracts a greater share of high-value manufacturing, Foxconn, the Taiwanese manufacturing giant, may even begin producing iPhones in the country. Even the most optimistic outcomes come with important caveats. An investment surge comes with numerous short-term impacts, with new factories raising real estate prices while taxing Vietnam's improving but nonetheless inferior infrastructure. Demand for skilled workers will also outpace supply if growth moves too fast. These problems will not stop Vietnam's rise. As one of the world's fastest developing countries, its infrastructure will catch up and the quality of its labor force will increase. And while rising land prices may turn away some investors, those least likely to be bothered will be the higher value industries that Vietnam so desperately wants to attract as part of the so-called Industrial Revolution 4.0. But Vietnam, the world's 15th largest country at around 95 million people, simply can never fill China's gigantic boots in the global supply chain. Vietnam is slightly less populous than China's southern Guangdong province, the birthplace of Chinese special economic zones in 1979 and still a key component in its manufacturing. Foxconn has its flagship campus in Guangdong, while Chinese tech giants Huawei and ZTE are headquartered there. The province, with its easy access to Hong Kong and coastal ports, is the foundation of China's role in the global economy. If China's role in the world's supply chain starts to be questioned, investment in Vietnam or other aspirants will largely be absorbed from Guangdong. But Vietnam, independent country that it is, has none of the benefits that come with being a province of a vast, economically diversified nation with the world's largest workforce. But Vietnam, independent country that it is, has none of the benefits that come with being a province of a vast, economically diversified nation with the world's largest workforce. According to Beijing's most recent national census, conducted in 2010, around one-third of Guangdong's population of 104 million were migrants from elsewhere in China. While Vietnam's rural population of around 65% certainly leaves room for urban migration to bolster manufacturing, the country lacks China's hundreds of millions ready to travel to fill positions. The factories in the Pearl River Delta churning out iPhones and Nike sneakers can rely on a steady stream of migrants from across China to man the assembly lines, while Vietnam has only itself to turn to. And while Guangdong residents can eat pork raised in Sichuan and rice grown in the Yangtze River breadbasket, Vietnam will not let the Mekong Delta, one of the world's largest rice-producing regions, go the route of the highly urbanized Pearl River Delta. A more developed Vietnam, conscious of its people's sentimental attachment to their farmland and notions of self-reliance enshrined in state ideology, would likely follow in the footsteps of Japan and opt for robust, mechanized, and compact agriculture. Farming in Guangdong, by contrast, has been rapidly marginalized since the 1980s and is set to be sidelined further by China's Greater Bay Area Plan, which aims to promote urban-based economic integration between mainland Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Macau. Vietnam, the world's third-largest rice exporter, will at the very least continue to grow enough crops to feed its own people. It certainly will not be abandoning its tried-and-true rice export trade anytime soon. Despite these limits, Vietnam has many trade advantages over China. Labor costs are cheaper, for now, and the country is a signatory to free trade agreements with South Korea and the 10 other remaining members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, including Japan, Canada, and Australia. The European Union is also in the final stages of ratifying a free trade agreement with Vietnam. And, despite Vietnam's $39.5 billion trade surplus in 2018 with the United States, US President Donald Trump has thus far seemed to have taken a liking to Vietnam. While the Hanoi summit between Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un ended in failure, things went far better for the host. Trump appeared pleased when he made time during his visit to watch the ceremonial signing of a combined $15.7 billion purchase of Boeing airplanes by two local budget airlines, with one of the Vietnamese carriers also signing a $5.3 billion deal with General Electric for aircraft engines. Today, Vietnam is one of the stars of the emerging markets universe. Its economic growth of 6 to 7% rivals China, and its exports are worth as much as the total value of its GDP. Anything from Nike sportswear to Samsung smartphones are manufactured in this ASEAN nation. Such is the success of the country, Sheng Lu, an assistant professor at the University of Delaware, told the Financial Times that there are few spare workers or production facilities left. So how did this growth miracle happen? According to analysts from the World Bank and the think tank Brookings, Vietnam's economic rise can be explained by three main factors. First, it has embraced trade liberalization with gusto. Second, it has complemented external liberalization with domestic reforms through deregulation and lowering the cost of doing business. Finally, Vietnam has invested heavily in human and physical capital, predominantly through public investments. Regarding the first factor, the analysts point to the various free trade agreements Vietnam has signed in the last 20 years. In 1995, Vietnam joined the ASEAN Free Trade Area. In 2000, it signed a free trade agreement with the US. And in 2007 it joined the World Trade Organization. Since then, further ASEAN agreements followed with China, India, Japan, and Korea. And just this year, the amended Trans-Pacific Partnership went into effect, albeit without the US. The cumulative effect of all these agreements was to gradually lower the tariffs imposed on both imports and exports to and from Vietnam, as shown in the graph below. Vietnam is open for business. Vietnam is open for business. Image, Brookings Future Developments. The government's drive towards an open economy also included domestic reforms. In 1986 the country created its first law on foreign investment, enabling foreign companies to enter Vietnam. Since then, law firm Baker & McKenzie said in a 2016 report, the law has been revised a number of times, mainly to adopt a more pro-investor approach while aiming to reduce administrative bureaucracy and better facilitate foreign investment into Vietnam. Vietnam's efforts did not go unnoticed in international rankings. In the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, Vietnam rose from 77th place in 2006 to 55th in 2017. In the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business rankings, meanwhile, Vietnam rose from 104th place in 2007 to 68th place in 2017. Last year, the bank said, Vietnam made progress on everything from enforcing contracts, increasing access to credit and electricity, paying taxes and trading across borders. Finally, Vietnam invested a lot in its human capital and infrastructure. Facing a rapidly growing population, it stands at 95 million today, half of whom are under 35, and up from 60 million in 1986. Vietnam made large public investments in primary education. This was necessary, as a growing population also means a growing need for jobs. But Vietnam also invested heavily in infrastructure, ensuring cheap mass access to the internet. The fourth industrial revolution is knocking on Southeast Asia's door, and having a sound IT infrastructure in place is essential preparation. Those investments paid off. Armed with the necessary infrastructure and with market-friendly policies in place, Vietnam became a hub for foreign investment and manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Japanese and Korean electronics companies like Samsung, LG, Olympus and Pioneer and countless European and American apparel makers set up shop in the country. By 2017, the Financial Times reported, Vietnam was the largest exporter of clothing in the region and the second largest exporter of electronics, after Singapore. Vietnam today is a major global exporter. Vietnam today is a major global exporter. Image, WTO, Financial Times. Economic growth followed suit. Since 2010, Vietnam's GDP growth has been at least 5% per year, and in 2017 it peaked at 6.8%. With such rapid economic growth, the country grew from one of the poorest countries in the world to a comfortably middle-income one. Whereas its GDP per capita was barely $230 in 1985, it was more than 10 times that in 2017, $2,343. Corrected for purchasing power, it stands even higher, at over $6,000. Vietnam's per capita GDP has increased tenfold over the past 30 years. Vietnam's per capita GDP has increased tenfold over the past 30 years. Image, Google, World Bank. Importantly, the economic growth was fairly inclusive. According to the World Economic Forum's Inclusive Development Index, Vietnam is part of a group of economies that have done particularly well at making their growth processes more inclusive and sustainable. Women too, fared better. Their employment rate is within 10% of that of men, notes the World Bank, and women-led households are less likely than those led by men to be poor, although inequalities remain. One important downside, however, is the government's approach to human rights and privacy. Press freedom is one of the worst in the world, citizens are increasingly surveilled online, and human rights activists not welcome. As an example, 2 human rights activists invited to this year's World Economic Forum on ASEAN were denied a visa to enter the country. Could anything stop Vietnam's ascent? With the appetite for globalization on the wane in many parts of the country, Vietnam looks particularly vulnerable, as the Financial Times reported earlier this year. Its exports are worth 99.2% of its GDP, and as shown previously, much of its success is based on foreign investment and trade. As an emerging market, it may also fall out of favor as a place to invest in because of the strengthening dollar. But for now, Vietnam looks to profit from rather than be hurt by increasing global trade tensions. Although the US has backed out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, its antagonism so far has had a greater impact on China than on Vietnam. The US government slapped imports on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese products, which has led companies with a manufacturing site in China to consider relocating to countries like Vietnam. But even if Vietnam does get hurt by increasing Western protectionism, it can still count on its own burgeoning middle class to deliver the next boost of growth. Both domestic and international retailers are eyeing rapid expansion in the country, as more and more people gain the purchasing power to consume goods and services. It may mean that one day, instead of the hustle and bustle of small shops and scooters, Vietnam will be characterized by large malls and cars. But for now, Vietnam is growing, at its own pace, and in its own way. Multi-billion-dollar purchases of American goods have become something of a tradition when Vietnamese leaders meet Trump. When Prime Minister Nguyen Xuan Phuc visited the White House in May 2017, Trump hailed 13 transactions worth some $8 billion announced during the visit. 6 months later, during Trump's state visit to Hanoi following the annual Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Da Nang, other deals were signed in Trump's presence, much to his delight, worth $12 billion. Hanoi has seemed to have found the right buttons to push with Trump, who, despite mentioning the deficit incidentally during the 2016 election campaign, mostly says only nice things about Vietnam these days. Should Vietnam continue its upward trajectory toward becoming a developed economy, it may well be in part due to absorbing investment away from China along the way. It has certainly presented itself as a worthy alternative to some of the world's largest firms in the past year. But it has neither the capacity nor the need to make its fortune as the world's factory. As Taiwan and South Korea demonstrated in the second half of the 20th century, there are other ways to get rich. Vietnam's leaders understand this, and foreign investors should take note.
Thank you for watching another Vietnamistic video. One more thing. All the world